We live in an era positively obsessed with the apocalypse. Think for just a moment of the number of doomsday films that have come out in the last 10 years or so. The Road, for instance, an adaptation of Cormac McCarthy's incredible novel of the same name, in which a father and son struggle to survive in a post-apocalyptic United States, in which civilization has ended and most remaining humans are cannibals. Or on a lighter note, Sharknado, which should be proof to all of us that there's still significant financial reward for no good, terrible, downright stupid ideas. Or consider the AMC phenomenon The Walking Dead, an incredible zombie thriller whose empire spans not only the TV series, but card games, video games, board games, and an upcoming feature film. The American appetite for the end of the world, zombies and otherwise, cannot be sated. And this can make it incredibly difficult for us to get our minds around the season of Advent. For 4 weeks prior to Christmastide, the church commemorates one advent of God while looking forward to another. We commemorate the coming of God in Jesus of Nazareth in the first century by entering into the spirit of the messianic expectation that his first followers would have had, the expectation that he answered for them. We do so in order to stoke the desire of our own hearts for the coming of God in judgment and consummation. It's hard to do the latter when the primary ways we have of imagining the end of the world involve zombies, pandemics, and nuclear or ecological disaster, or something of that sort. Whatever comes of these, I'm not too worried about the zombies, although the other ones seem reasonably plausible. They are not the end described by our scriptures. The world could very well end as a result of one of these cataclysms. I can't tell if it will or won't, neither can you. But even if it does, that would not be the end in the biblical sense, the one toward which we look each year during Advent. That end is something else entirely. The coming of a world in which God's will is done on earth as it is in heaven. The theological conviction behind Advent is opposed to the attitude which animates our various cultural apocalypses. It is the confidence that the world matters, and that the world matters to God. It is the confidence that God cares enough about the world to be invested in its comings and goings, its sorrows and injustices, petty and atrocious alike. God cares enough to take notice of them, and cares enough to do something about them. It is the confidence that God cares enough for the world to save and preserve it from ruin, and cares enough about the world's integrity and freedom not to save it in any way that would contradict or compromise its freedom, bludgeoning us into submission or overriding our free choices by fiat like a cosmic dictator. Our Lord does not insist on his own way, now or ever, but opts instead for the way of the cross. And this is a really crucial point, because so many of the stories in the Bible about judgment, many of which we will read over the next 3 Sundays, can sound like just the opposite. Okay? It can sound like one day, the last day to which our collect refers, God will finally lose God's temper, as it were. Jesus will return in the form of the Terminator and will gun down all of God's enemies. And that can't be right. It just cannot be right. Interpretations like these draw God's power too much in the image of our own. They imagine that God will resolve the very real conflict between good and evil, life and nothingness, that ravages our world in much the same way that we would, with a war or something quite like it. Whenever I see violence and catastrophe in passages like this, I take them to be one of two things. They are either of human or natural origin, okay, as when in our gospel lesson 2 Sundays ago, Jesus warned of wars and insurrections and great earthquakes. I think we can assume that between us and the natural world, we are perfectly capable of coming up with wars and earthquakes without God's help or assistance. So I assume that it's us and not God, okay? Or I assume that the violence and catastrophe is an apocalyptic depiction of the goings-on of our present world, not the future, but now, this world right now, from the vantage point of eternity, from which perspective God and all that opposes God are caught up in a very real conflict. And that we see most clearly in the bewildering stories found in the book of Revelation, particularly in its first 20 chapters or so. Everything running up to the moment when the New Jerusalem descends and it says God will wipe away every tear from our eyes. The violence that ensues before that is God looking at this world and seeing a battle within it between sin and goodness, between death and life. From a Christian perspective, the hope pointed to by passages like ours from the prophet Isaiah this morning is that that conflict will come to an end one day. In fact, its victory, the victory of good, is guaranteed in advance. And with that victory, with the end of that conflict, God will fashion a new heaven and a new earth out of the old one. A new creation in which, as that passage from Revelation puts it, death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more. For the first things will have passed away. God cares about the world enough to see that it actually becomes the world God intended it to be. And to do so so ingeniously that not one good bit of it will be destroyed or tampered with. Not even the freedom in which we presently rebel against him. Jesus suffered this ingenuity on the cross, and we suffer it in the pain and sorrow of our lives as we await what St. Paul calls the redemption of our bodies. From a Christian perspective, then, the end of the world isn't bad news, it's good. And one of the best ways I think Christians can answer the doomsday obsession of our culture is to do the opposite, oddly enough, of what Jesus literally tells us to this morning, which is to sleep. The anxiety of our world today is breathless. We are riddled with worry over wars and insurrections, impending ecological disaster, political conspiracies and instability. All those things of which Jesus warned 2 Sundays ago, as if he knew what he was actually talking about. I think this is one of the reasons why the end of the world is so often on our cultural menu. Our gut reaction is not to expect the coming of the Son of Man to answer any of this. That is, our gut reaction is not to trust in God's gracious provision, up to and including the provision of life in death. Our gut reaction instead is to be busy. We have the opposite problem of the owner of the house described by Jesus in this morning's parable. We aren't asleep because we're unaware of when the Son of Man is coming. We are wide awake all the time, working and piddling and fretting because we're quite sure he isn't. Make no mistake, I don't mean to counsel irresponsibility. The challenges we face today demand a great deal of us, and I pray that God will give us the grace to meet them. But very often, Christians join the rest of the world in acting as though the future of our world is all up to us. And the whole point of Advent is that it's not. Making time to rest, being revolutionary enough to get enough sleep at night, especially at the end of the fiscal year, especially at the end of the semester, especially in the run-up to the holidays, is one of the ways we can testify to the hope that we have, that we in our world have a future, simply because we matter to God. In the end, it's His, not ours, to save us. And He can do so even while we're sleeping.